So my name is Michael Douma. I'm a professor at Georgetown University's Business School. I'm also a historian of the Dutch in the United States, and I've written about both in the Midwest and in the East Coast. And today we have a seminar from the Netherlands-America Foundation, and they'd like me to remind you that it's the 100th anniversary of NAF that they're celebrating this year, that their mission is to strengthen the bonds between the US and the Netherlands. And particularly this year, they're doing a lot of these great online seminars. And of course, you can make a donation to NAF at thenaf.org. So take a look at that. Today, the topic of our seminar is Dutch letters of marque and arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia. And we have two people that are joining us today for this discussion. First is Leendert van der Valk, who is a freelance journalist in Utrecht, who recently, in January, I believe, wrote an article for the NRC in the Netherlands about this first slaves brought to Virginia and the Dutch ship that brought them. And so the questions are going to be, from my end, pointed mostly towards Leendert, but we also have some questions, and we've brought into this discussion Vincent Tucker of Richmond, Virginia. And Vincent is the president of the William Tucker 1624 Society, and he's a direct descendant of the first child of African ancestry known to be born in Virginia. And he's going to have some interesting perspectives on this research as well. We have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. After I give about 30 minutes of questions and answers to Leendert and Vincent, I will moderate the Q&A and read the questions that you type in there for the others to answer. So at any point, if you want to leave a question, go ahead and click on that, and I'll try to get to them all. So we're going to start with a quick summary, a couple minutes from Leendert, so he can tell us about his article and some of the background and development of this project and why it's so fascinating, why we're gathered here today. So I'll turn it over to Leendert.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and yeah, thank you for having me and for inviting me to this webinar. I see we have over 120 participants. That's great. So I'm happy to be able to talk about this topic to a Dutch American audience, because the piece that I wrote is actually exactly about that, the relationship and the historical ties between the US and the Netherlands. And I thought maybe it's best if I explain a bit about, well, who I am and especially how I got to work on this specific topic, the arrival of the first Africans in Virginia in 1619. Because it is a bit of an odd way how I got involved in this story. I am a freelance journalist, and my main news outlet is NRC. So that's one of the main Dutch daily newspapers. But I usually write about music, and I write a lot about Afro-Caribbean music, but also American popular music and jazz and blues. And the topic of 1619 actually came across in my research for a nonfiction book called Voodoo. I'll explain later if what the title is about, but it's this book. And that was back in 2014 or so. And for this book, I traveled from the Mississippi Delta to New Orleans, to the Caribbean and West Africa. And when I was doing research, well, I was researching how a lot of African spiritual rhythms are still the foundation of a lot of music that we hear today. We forgot about that, but that is definitely the case. So one of the questions that came up was, when was the first African drum actually heard in the US? And that, of course, leads to the question, when did the first Africans arrive? And when you start Googling that, or you start reading and researching, you quite quickly come across the story of Virginia in 1619. And I read everywhere, so this was 6-7 years ago. Then I read everywhere in the American articles that I found that there was a Dutch connection, because the sources talked about the Dutch man of war, or a Dutch captain, or a ship from Vlissingen. And I was intrigued and well, actually, I doubted it a bit, I guess, because I had never heard of it before, and that really surprised me. How could it be that this story was supposedly known on the other side of the Atlantic, but in Holland, no one has ever heard of it. Because when I started asking around if maybe I had missed something, but it seemed like no one in the Netherlands knew this story. Even some historians, for example, at museums, they gave me a blank look when I talked about this. So I kept it in the back of my mind, and I wanted to publish about it in 2019, which seemed like a logical year to publish about this. But it never really took off because I was working on yet another book. So I thought that someone else would write it, but that never happened. Well, at least not in the Dutch press. Of course, in the US, there was for example, the 1619 project of New York Times, and there was a lot of debate about it, and that coincided with the new look on colonial history. The same kind of discussion that is going on in the Netherlands, by the way, but there was never really a connection between this 1619 and the Dutch point of view. So then I pitched it at NRC anyway in 2020. And that was just before COVID hit. And the people at the newsroom were enthusiastic about it. And I actually remember that the first day that I went to the newsroom to discuss this with some of the editors, it was the first week that there was an infection in Holland. So the whole newspaper was about Corona, COVID. And a few weeks later, all my regular work was gone because there were no concerts to go to and no festivals and no shows. So it turned out that this 1619 project became a bit of my Corona project. And of course, I had planned to visit Virginia and to visit people like Vincent Tucker, who's also here and has also been a major source for me. But we did that by a Zoom meeting like this. So that was one of the things that never happened. I couldn't visit Virginia for this story, but luckily I could do a lot of research from behind the computer. There are a lot of digital scans in archives, thank goodness. And in the end, with help from Ivo van Loo as well, an archivist at the Zealand Archives, we were able to reconstruct the voyage of the White Lion. So the ship from Flushing that brought and sold the first Africans in mainland British America. And we found a document signed by Maurice of Orange, Maurits van Oranje, that we think proves that it was actually the mayor of Flushing, because he received this letter, who sent that ship to the Caribbean to protect the very first colonies of sealant in South America. And there, well, a lot of things happened. It pirated on a Portuguese ship, took almost 30 captured people from Angola, among them Antonio and Isabella, and sold them in Virginia in 1619. And 5 years later, Antonio and Isabella would have a baby called William Tucker. Vincent is the descendant of William Tucker, who's now known as the first registered African American. So it turned out that after a lot of research and a lot of luck in the archives as well, that we were able to reconstruct this, and think that the highest powers in the Netherlands at that moment, the mayor of one of the major port cities and the Prins Stadhouder, were responsible for selling those Africans. And I think it's a very relevant story for the Netherlands, naturally, but also for the US. It's already known as 1619. Is sort of an iconic year now in the US, as I understand it. But this part of the story missed, I think, from a Dutch perspective. well, that was basically a very short introduction to the story, but I think we'll get more into detail with questions from Michael and from the audience.
All right, very good. So because I'm a historian, my questions are going to be mainly focused on your historical research and what you discovered and how you discovered it. So in the Q&A, people can feel free to ask more of the cultural relevance questions of today and other types of questions. But I wanted to start off, first of all, I want to say I read this when it came out first in Dutch, and I'm one of the people that shared it on Facebook to other people. And I was just blown away because I like these international mystery stories that start in archives. That's where historians feel most comfortable. Now, you found 3 letters of marque in the archives of the Zeeland Admiralty at the National Archives. So I have a 3-part question for you. So you probably don't need to write these down because you can get this. First of all, as background for people that don't know, first, what is a letter of marque? Why are these 3 letters particularly interesting? And were historians, any historians, familiar with these? I mean, did you completely discover these, or did you more so find their relevance, but they had already been discovered?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the first part of the question, what is a letter of marque? It's called a kaperbrief in Dutch. It is a letter that captains would get, which enabled them to actually, well, you can't really say that they pirate on other ships, but that's basically what it is. But then with the permission of a king or a prince or a nation or so a higher power, and then it's legal within war laws as far as they are there. But it was the main powers at that moment agreed that it was legal as long as you had one of those letters to enter another ship and to take its cargo. I guess that's what a letter of marque is. And then these letters of marque, there are so the administration of those letters, because the letters themselves usually get lost because they go out to sea and you have to return them if you ever return. But the administration of that of those letters is in the Zeeland archives, and I guess these 3 particular letters were known to a couple of archivists, but they never linked it to this 1619 story, and they were a bit of an odd letters of marque, because usually a letter of marque would have the name of a ship and of a captain in it. And the thing is, in these 3 letters, there is no mention of any specific captain or ship, but it is signed for the mayor of Flushing. So he's the financier of this expedition. I don't have I answered all 3 of the questions now?
Yeah,
I
think that's good. And there's other questions coming in. So just a reminder, don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A for those that are putting questions in, and I'll look at those when we hit halfway here. So it's essentially a privateer ship. And in Dutch, it's called de Witte Leeuw, but in English, we're just going to call it the White Lion, because that's what they call it in one English source, and that's the literal translation. You were able to track its course and reconstruct its course around the Caribbean and North America. Can you tell us where it went, and how do you know that it went there?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the there are actually, I don't want to make it too complex, but there's actually another ship involved, because the White Lion worked together with an English ship, and a lot of the things we know about the White Lion comes from the law cases that were made against this ship, which is called the Treasurer, and it's quite a notorious ship back in the days. And this was an English ship, so there were quite a lot of documents in English archives, and that was what is already known in the US as well. So most of what we know now from the White Lion comes from those sources. But what we also know is that that the Zealanders also had the first colonies in South America at Essequibo and Oiapoque. So those were really small colonies, and the Dutch were only just beginning to to form colonies. I mean, that was the first attempt, really. And one of the and we know that there had to be this letter of marque in the archives, because those archives are complete, and it is known from the English sources that the White Lion had a Dutch letter of marque that is confirmed in different sources. So we know that there has to be this this letter of marque, and then all of the other letters of marque had different names in it, different captains, and this one was actually the only one. Well, that is compatible with the dates that are involved. So when did the ship leave Zealand, and also with a lot of other things around it. And one is, for example, that there's this one source that talks about this letter of marque. It talks briefly about the Africans on board. And it mentions the ship. So this is a source from Virginia, it's John Rolfe. And he briefly mentions the ship, but half of what he tells about this is about this letter of marque, which seems to be remarkable for him. And he says this is a really large and ample commission, I think he calls it. And that is, all the other letters of marque are quite strict in what you can and cannot do. So you, for example, you cannot just attack any Portuguese or Spanish ship. It has to attack you first, and then you have to, then you may respond with violence. But in this specific letter of marque, there was no such mention, and the ship could go anywhere in the West Indies, and it could also sell its cargo anywhere it wanted. These are three things that are totally different from any other letter of marque that we know from that period. And so that kind of adds to the or it makes sense if you compare it to the things we know about this letter of marque from the letter of John Rolfe.
Yeah. Now, can you explain, how did the Africans get aboard the White Lion and then transport to the mainland North America? Because the White Lion never went to Africa, correct?
No, that's correct. So that's what privateers do. They just wait for other ships to load their cargo and then attack on them somewhere else. So this was a Portuguese ship. It was a Portuguese ship that took people from Angola, and they were on its way to Mexico, to Veracruz. And well, somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, it encountered the Dutch White Lion and the English ship, the Treasurer. And those ships were made for attacking for attacking those Portuguese ships. So they didn't have a lot of trouble in in overpowering the Portuguese ship. So they took not all, because there were a lot of people on board. It was heavily loaded. I think we have to do this from my head, but I think it was built for 200 people, and there were 400 people in Angola that came upon the ship. And in the end, the Treasurer and the White Lion took about 30 people each on the English and the Dutch ship, and then they had to find a way to sell them somewhere. And apparently the treasurer, the captain from the treasurer had friends in Virginia. Well, at least that's what he thought. And they went to Virginia to sell the Africans that they took from the Portuguese ship.
Okay. So I have one additional source related question, and that is, how common are records from this period regarding ships? That is, you and other historians that have looked at this, would you expect to find more about the ship than what you have found, or less? That is, you haven't found the ship's log somewhere, but you did find this letter from an English source from 1620, where they just captured a glimpse of it. So can a Dutch ship sail all the way around the Caribbean and come back to the Netherlands in that period and not get mentioned in the records? Or is it we're just lucky that we actually have 3 sources or 4 sources that mention it?
Yeah, so this was one of the main questions that I had as well, and I have to be clear about this. I'm not an historian, and I think I know a bit of my way around historical sources, but I'm definitely not trained as an historian. So I rely on other historians as well as my sources. And I ask those questions to a lot of people who know this period very well. And most of them say it would be totally logical if you didn't find anything at all, because there were so many ships going back and forth. And if it's all within the law, then you usually don't find a lot. Except in those sources like where they kept the letters of marque and other administrational sources. But some of those have been damaged or got lost, especially in the Zealand archives. There, during the Second World War, there was damage at that archive, and also before another war with France, there's also has been a bit of damage to the archive. So some of those we just can't find, like more information on the captain and on also the mayor who sent them out would be in different archives, but we can't find those. But it would be logical not to find anything at all.
Yeah, now there's some question about just how Dutch the ship was.
Yeah.
Was the crew, the captain, English? I mean,
yes,
what was the
probably.
makeup?
Yeah, I think that's my gut feeling, that it would have been a mixed crowd, but with definitely a lot of English on board as well, and that has to do with with the town of Flushing, where it started and where its home base. The Flushing was I forgot the mortgage town, I think it's called in English. So it was a town that was handed over sort of to the English Queen for her support to the Dutch war against the Spanish at a few years before 1619. So there were a lot of Dutch English connections to the Flushing port, and actually there were a lot of soldiers, English soldiers, and also mariners in Flushing. And Flushing was the town to go to for English captains and English crew and English ships to get letters of marque, because they were not issued at that moment in England. But you could go to Flushing, which is just on the other side of the North Sea, and there you could get those letters, and you could get crew. So I guess we also know that the captain was English, so probably some of his crew was English too. But so there is indeed debate about, is this a Dutch ship or is this an English ship?
Okay, so we've been blaming the Dutch all along in American history for bringing the first African slaves to Virginia. What has been the response in the Netherlands, and do you want to continue to? Is there enough blame to go around, or do you want to do you want to hold to that view that the Dutch are responsible for the introduction of slaves?
Well, I think the most important thing is that the Dutch have played a major role here. So it was the mayor of one of the major ports at that moment, port cities, and it was the Maurits van Oranje who signed the letter that actually made all this possible. So yeah, I would be fair to say that the blame is on the Dutch here, at least for a large part.
So one reason why I think this is such an important story is that it's really the missing link at the very beginning of things. And as historians and people who are interested in history, we're always interested in origin stories. These are very important, right? So I want to turn now to some questions about the significance for Virginian history, US history, and African American history, and bring Vincent into this discussion as well. And so first of all, Vincent, can you tell me, when did you first hear about Leendert and his work on this, and what was your response when he contacted you?
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. It was probably close to a year ago now, I think Leendert had contacted us as he was researching, just to have a Zoom call, just to have an open conversation about our family, you know, the history of the arrival of the first ship at Point Comfort, which is in Hampton, Virginia. And so we just had a dialogue, and he was explaining to us the work he was doing and researching, and that's how the relationship began.
Okay. Tell us about the family's claim. How do you know that you are a descendant of William Tucker, and how important is this discovery of your origins for the group, for your society, for yourself?
That's a great question, Michael. So I am 59, and I can say that most of my life, the story has been passed on to us that we have always been in that Hampton area. Now, our family also owned what is called Tucker Cemetery, which is about a quarter of a mile from where William Tucker, or Captain William Tucker's plantation was. He was one of those who purchased some of the enslaved that came to the shores in 1619. And those enslaved were traded for food and supplies. So at that beginning of Captain William Tucker owning the enslaved, and two of those were Isabella and Anthony, who, according to the mustard, was on the White Lion at its arrival. It was part of the 20 and odd that came off of that Dutch ship onto the shores in 1619. So our cemetery is a quarter of a mile from the plantation, and that cemetery in the latter part of 1800s, family members and non-family members, well, it was like a social club, the Celsius Club, had gone to the current owner, and we asked to purchase that. And there was no value to the cemetery, but it was value to us. It wasn't valuable to anyone else. And that cemetery housed many of my ancestors. And also we did a radar scan several years ago and discovered over 100 hidden graves beyond the surface that wasn't above surface. Captain William Tucker had owned about 9,000 acres in that Hampton Roads area. And we believe that that cemetery was part of the plantation. And so going back even beyond that, we were always told from family members that we were, we have always been there and we were part of those who came over. And the story just goes, it just continues to go back. Since then, we are researching more of the history. We're learning, getting new leads all the time, just from not only Leendert, but other sources of what happened, how did it happen? Because we want to know who are associated with us, who are our relatives. And that's something that over years we weren't able to carry a birth certificate with us everywhere we went. And we had to rely on those stories passed down from generation to generation, birth and death records, cemeteries, just to try to keep up with family and which direction they headed in, and on and so forth.
Yeah, so let me ask you then, this was published in Dutch, but from what I understand, they've made an English translation. It's just that it hasn't yet, and this is something that Leendert is going to be working on, I'm sure, trying to publish this in the United States in the correct place. So at some point you were given the English translation, or you were told about what he discovered. Did you share this with others in the society? What was your response and their response?
Actually, we have shared that link or that story in the English version to other historians that we know. We have, I think Leendert shared it with USA Today newspaper, and we have some contacts, and we have also shared a copy of that. So we haven't gotten much feedback. I've gotten feedback from our family members that, they were just amazed of how this story developed, looking at the timeline that he listed in the paper. So it is a remarkable piece. And I do think that in time that paper will be distributed into the right hands and be added to the story. I'm convinced of that, because that is a huge piece of information. And it clarifies a lot of the questions that we have all had over the years. How exactly did the White Lion end up connecting with the San Juan Bautista that was heading to Veracruz, and where did the treasure come from? So some of those stories we have heard of, but getting death perception and research on that, it brings the story a lot alive to us and a lot more powerful than we ever thought.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's what history should be all about. So we're at about halfway, so or a little over. So I'm gonna jump into the Q&A, and I haven't looked at these yet. So I'll start with the top. Martin, I'm not sure if I'm going to be pronouncing these in the Dutch manner or the English manner. Martin Knook, if it's English, Knook, says, have you found some hints in the archives explaining why the story was an unknown to historians? So maybe if Leendert wants to hit that question, why? So one of my things is, we historians were jealous when you journalists get the scoop on something before we do. Did it require a journalist to ferret this out? Why hadn't historians done more with this in the past, Leendert?
I can't speak for the historians, but I think what has helped is that I really started to see what had already been published about it, and just dive deep into the story from a bit of an outsider's perspective, and that sometimes helps. But in the end, I did have to, the new things that I found was I couldn't have done without help of the archivists at Zealand Archives, because that is one of the things I can't read the 16th, 17th century Dutch, or at least not when it's written. So I have to rely on other people there as well, and of course where to find those. So I'm not sure. I think what usually happens here, I guess, is that there's one convincing story that has been told, and then why should you look into it again? But the thing is that there has only been one historian that has seriously looked at this from a Dutch perspective, and I think he didn't come up with the right conclusions. We kind of countered his perspective, but it has surprised me that no one has ever really dug into it before. I didn't find. I think the question was, did you find any leads to why this has never been on the historian's radar before? I don't know, maybe because the name never showed up anywhere. So there's no mention of the name White Lion, for example, in the Dutch archives. And maybe that's where it just ends. And you have to, I looked at a lot of different sources that maybe are a bit out of the scope of an historian. I'm not sure. But so no, sorry, I don't have a clear answer to this.
Yeah, I wonder if it might be something to do with just an international perspective, because as you discovered, 1619 was well known in the US, but not in the Netherlands. They're looking for the White Lion in the United States, but nobody in the Netherlands is looking for De Witte Leeuw, right? And so sometimes it's just putting that connection together and saying, well, I can do this, you know, yes. And obviously you did. We have a couple similar questions, and I don't know if either I or Leendert can answer these, but they're about the Dutch being active in slave trade at this point. I'm not a historian of the 17th century, 18th and 19th, so I'm not sure if the Dutch already had slaves in Brazil or in and around Suriname at this point. Can you answer that better?
Yeah, the story that how it's usually told now, where a lot of historians also agree upon, is that the real involvement of Dutch in slavery started with the West Indian Company, and that is 1621. So that's 2 years later, but then only after the first colonies in Brazil started. So that would be 1630. So this is before that. But one of the things that I found when I was doing research around this 1690 project is that there, by the privateers, it was definitely known how this worked. The Dutch privateers knew about slavery and about where you could get people and sell people. So, for example, in the island of Bermuda, there are quite a few records that English records where it is said that a Dutch ship sold Africans there, and they captured those from the Portuguese, just like in 1619. So the involvement of the Dutch in slave trade at the beginning of the 17th century was by privateering, not by getting slaves from Africa. But also, I think more and more sources come up that actually it has begun even then with Dutch ships going to the West African coast. But there's very little known about this. I'm actually now working on a new project, which is even before 1619, and then there are also already records from Dutch captains going to Angola or going to Benin to get slaves. But it's not on an industrial scale as it later became, because there were no plantations yet.
There's going to be a number of similar questions, so I apologize to some people if I skip over yours or combine them with others, because a lot of people are asking about the Dutch role in slavery in general, and they do become a large carrier of slaves, and the Dutch do have slave plantations in Suriname, in Brazil for a while, in various islands in the Caribbean. and even in New York or New Jersey until they lose that to the English. So the Dutch are involved in the slave trade in a number of places. So that's just the sort of general context, and we can't give a whole presentation about the Dutch involvement everywhere and everything. So we're going to have to focus on the specific cases here. We do have a good question from just have the first initial G. Holwerda, who asks, or he gives a very good definition of letters of marque. He says these letters sanctioned theft, right? And that might be a good way of saying it. So he asks, under what circumstances were these granted? Why were the letters of marque provided? So maybe why couldn't a ship just sail out on its own without letters of marque and just be a pirate?
Well, they could. I mean, there are pirates, but then you could go to court if you ever came back, and there are quite a lot of cases known, especially in England, where people ended up with a death sentence for pirating. This is actually what plays around the treasurer case. So letters of marque, especially from a Dutch perspective, were issued out because it sort of was a safe way to still fight Spanish and Portuguese interests in well, across the globe, without having war on your own in your own country. There was war, of course, going on with Spain anyway, but and it served two goals actually. So one is just trying to frustrate the trade from Spain, and the other is by gaining the cargo, you can sell it anywhere else, and so that had an economic benefit as well. And the best known privateer in Holland is Piet Hein, who captured the silver flow there. Every Dutchie should know this, which was like the main attack on Spanish gold and silver fleet, and that was in 1628, if I'm correct. It was a very common way in Holland to make war and make profit against Spain.
So we have a number of questions about Flushing, the mayor of Flushing, why who he is, and why it would be in his interest to give a letter of marque. And we have also a question about geography. So Flushing is in Zeeland or Zeeland, and it's in Dutch Vlissingen. Mm-hmm. But yeah. Tell us about the mayor and his motivations.
Yeah, so the mayor is called Jan de Moor, and he's from a family. De Moor is a family of admirals. So they've always been involved in the admiralty. And the mayor is, well, a lot of people in power in Holland and Zeeland at that time were also involved in their private companies. This was the Dutch model for keeping power to themselves. They were serving Zeeland, but they were serving their own interests as well. And that's how you should see this kind of action, because he also gets support from Zeeland. They get cannons from Zeeland on the ships, but the rest of it was his own private company that invested in privateering, because privateering could make you profit. And he had the mayor, Jan de Moor, had started investing in the first colonies in South America. And that's why he wanted, and he knew that the Spanish were very annoyed about this, because they considered it their country or their colony. And so he knew that the colonies were under pressure, and that's why he sent out ships to privateer on the Spanish and Portuguese over there. Because, by the way, Spanish and Portugal were under one crown at that moment, so that's why the two sometimes get mixed up in the story.
There's a number of personal and specific questions coming in about relations to people's families, specific things about the slave trade. And I or Leendert would be happy to look at these or direct you to historians that know more about these particular topics if you email us at some point. We do have some comments. Jennifer Tosh makes an interesting point that the Dutch East India Company was already involved in slavery, and there's some good work by Marcus Vink about this, Mark Vink with a V, and others. That's an important point. So the Dutch are involved internationally in the slave trade, but in the Indian Ocean and various things. But we have a good question here from Susan Dijkstra. If you could give us some clarification. There's the White Lion and also the Treasurer, these two ships. Did they both sell Angolans in Virginia in 1619?
Yes, so they worked together, and the first ship to arrive in Virginia was the White Lion. And as far as it's clear from the records, they sold all the Angolans that they had on board in Virginia. Now, the Treasurer was, there's a lot going on in the Virginia Company at that time. There were shifting powers. And the captain from the Treasurer thought that he had friends in Virginia, but when he arrived, it turned out that that the powers had shifted against his interest. So what exactly happened is unclear. Maybe Vincent can add a bit, but as far as I know, is he sold maybe 2 or 3 people, but had to get out as soon as possible and went to Bermuda to sell the rest of his cargo. Vincent, is that correct?
Yeah, so sources tell us that the White Lion did appear at Fort Monroe or Point Comfort, I'm sorry, first, and then the Treasurer showed up several days later and first landed in Jamestown. And so they thought several years ago that it was the opposite, but sources and data show that the Treasurer showed up several days after the White Lion in Jamestown with Africans. Yes.
We have a point here from Michael King, who says that, pointing to Wikipedia, which I actually like as a source, but it's a different story. Wikipedia says that there's Dutch slave traders in Curacao and St. Eustatius quite early, 1596, 1601. Is this at variance with your information? And I'll just answer this quickly, and maybe Leendert can chime in. But I would say no, this is not at variance. So there's Dutch ships that are certainly trading slaves through the Caribbean and in and around Africa. The thing here is that we have the first Africans being brought to North America, to what becomes the 13 colonies. And that's what makes this story unique, right? Would you want to add anything to that, Leendert?
Yes, well, and I think that the ships and the captains that were involved already, they were all privateers. And I think the first mention of a Dutch captain really going to the African coast is from 1607 or so. If you go to the there's a website that slavevoyage.com, which has all the slave ships and their destinations, etc. But we are finding even mentions from even before that. But there was no regular trade between West African coast and the Caribbean from Dutch captains. They were usually just privateering on Portuguese ships.
Okay, we got a question that, Vincent, you might know something about this. I don't know how much research have you done into the background in Angola? What do you know about Angola in this period, who these people are? Do they have certain skills when they're brought over? Is there a particular reason why slave traders would be taking people from Angola?
Well, I don't have much. My sister Wanda has been over to Angola, and she's done a lot of research on that. I'm still heartbroken just understanding what happened once the enslaved got to America. But we do know that many that were captured were specialized in agricultural, farming, and they did have other trades because, heck, they were there to build Africa. So many of those skills that were that they had there, and we believe that they were taking those skilled workers and many of the younger people over because of their strength and ability to work in that capacity of slavery.
Okay, we do have a comment here from Peter Feynman. He says that the Dutch started encroaching on the Portuguese in Angola in the 1620s, but were unsuccessful, and that they temporarily displaced them in the 1640s. So as the Dutch were looking for their own foothold to bring slaves from Africa, they eventually did apparently control part of Angola for a while. We have another question for you, Vincent. Have you made contact with the descendants of the enslaver, which is the new term for slave owner, William Tucker? Are you familiar with that lineage?
Yes. Last year, I think it might have been November, I believe, 2019, so it wasn't last year. USA Today newspaper, they were able to contact Pam Tucker, who's living in Texas, who's a descendant from William Tucker, and brought her and our families together at Point Comfort, which is now Port Monroe. It was we did a tour throughout the city of Hampton to look at plantations that William Tucker owned. There were 2 locations where he was, and we broke bread together. She apologized to our families, to our family of what took place 400 years ago. So we have maintained a relationship with her. So it's been quite interesting, and we tried to pull and have pulled information from her, and I think her mother wrote a book prior to her passing away. So we are in contact with that side of the family.
Okay, fascinating. Some other good questions and comments coming in. One from Charlie Kaplan. He asked, could you please provide a website listing slave ships and their destinations? There is something called the Transatlantic Slave Database from David Eltis, which ELTIS, and he has a lot of that information. There's more of this stuff available online. There's also a lot of people making comments about other recent research on the Dutch slave world, and this has actually been quite active in the last few years among professional historians who are doing some of the economic study of Dutch slavery. Carwan Fata Black is one of them. We have a link here to a Parool article, Dutch newspaper. I'm not sure if everybody can see the Q&A, so if you have those types of links, you might want to put them in the chat as well if you can't see them in the Q&A. But there's a number of recent things going on, and perhaps somebody could give a good a good update of all this type of stuff. A lot of people have been asking Leendert, where can they read this in English? How can we promote this story? How can we talk with you more?
Yeah, so you can't read it in English yet. It's well, the newspaper NRC a few years ago, they sometimes translated articles like this and then published them in English, but they stopped doing that. And actually, I'm a bit surprised that it hasn't landed yet in US media. But then again, when I published it, it was beginning of January, and there were a lot of other things going on in the US, so that might have not, that wasn't a good time to drop another story I guess. But I'm hoping that there is that I can somehow get it in an English newspaper. I mean, an American newspaper. We were quite far with the USA today, but I haven't. I don't know. It stopped somewhere, and it's also because I just don't know the field. So if anyone has a connection to a newsroom, please let me know. And then,
Yeah,
maybe we can.
no offense, you don't want it in like the Holland Sentinel or something. You want this in the some big national newspaper where it can get picked up.
No, that would be great, of course. But in the end, to me, it matters most that it's at least available in English. And so I've sent Vincent, for example, and also you, Michael, I guess, the Dutch, an English translation that has been made by someone from Michigan University who did this for his students. But I can't send it to all people privately, so it has to be published somewhere, and then it's available for the bigger public. That's the main thing.
Yeah, and a number of people are asking where they can read this. I think you can search online. It is paywalled at the moment, I believe, on NRC. Do they still call themselves the Handelsblad? NRC Handelsblad?
We dropped that one week ago.
Oh, really? Okay, so
so it's now NRC.
Yeah. Okay.
But
perhaps Laura or Aaron can put a link in the chat if it's not there already. Sorry.
I think you can read the first 5 articles for free, so you should be able to. If you're not clicking on too many other articles, you can read it.
Well, I must have read 5 other free articles because I can't read it. Another good comment from Jennifer Tosh. There's a mappingslavery.nl, which I'll have to check out. But yeah, in general, there's just a lot of good new research. Raoul Belay put some good book and a website down. Various other things appearing.
Can I add a bit to what Vincent told about the skills that the people from Angola had? Well, why it might be interesting to get people from Angola to Virginia. We see that right after the arrival of those people, that the tobacco industry goes up, and that's not just because they have more people on the fields, but it's also because the people from Angola, and they were from the Ndongo kingdom probably, had this specific knowledge about crops like tobacco. And a lot of that is a very interesting book, I think. It's Central Africans from Linda Haywood and John Thornton. This is about, well, had, and they became so very important to the colonies.
Okay, we're at just about time. If I missed your question, I apologize. There's a lot of stuff going on in the chat right now. Lots of people contributing various things. I'm sure both of these guys would like to hear more. I think we're at the hour. So if there's any final comments, Leendert and Vincent, what do you want to see next?
Vincent, you first.
Well, I certainly would like to see additional research made and the efforts continue to see if there are any other territories that have participated in slavery that's not known, and to understand their reasoning behind it as well. It's a lot that we don't know. It's sad for Blacks because, to be transferred from one country to another and have your name changed and trying to trace your roots is very difficult. And taking on the name of the one that enslaved you is very challenging as well. So every time this subject comes about with me, it saddens my heart. But at the same time, I have to be open to learn so I can help teach others and share with others how this process begins. So those Dutch readers, those who are learning about their history as well, continue to search, continue to dig, and it brings much value.
Yeah, I totally agree with Vincent. I think it would be also very valuable if we would get to know more about we should get more names, for example. So we have Antonio and Isabella, and we can sort of give identity to the people, but we're missing so much. And I think in that perspective, that also from the perspective of Vincent's family, is the oral history is very important here. And I think it's oftentimes overseen as a valuable source, or it's even looked down upon as an historical source, but it's very valuable. So I hope that we get to see more interest in those stories. And from a Dutch perspective, yeah, I just hope that there's going to continue to be stories like these, that we get to know more about the involvement of the Dutch in the slave trade, because as all over the world, you know, history is told by the people in power, and we now get to see more perspectives, and we get to know more about some of the darker sides from Dutch history as well. And I think it's very important to know more about this, and there's a lot more to be known. So I'm just hoping that there's going to be more open debate about this. Still more. A lot of people think it's already quite, you know, that we're doing a lot, but there's a lot more to be done.
Right. Now, as moderator, it's my responsibility to make sure that this train reaches its destination on time and that we call an end to this seminar now. But I want to thank the Netherlands-America Foundation for putting this on, Leendert for his great work, Vincent for his great comments and contributions, and everyone for participating. Hopefully, when I shut this down, that the material in the chat will remain, or we can save it somehow. I'm not a Zoom expert. But I don't know if in the chat we can keep that open for a minute, but if Lauren or Aaron wants to put in any contact information, or if Leendert, I can add my email. Leendert, you could add yours perhaps, if people can't find it easily online. But so I don't think I'm responsible for this. I'll just shut my video off, but I'll leave the chat up for a few minutes. So if people want to add something, I think that might be a solution. I'm not sure in these days what our solutions are to these problems. But thanks again, everybody. It was great talking to you.
Thank you.